Okay, now we're recording. We're in this section where it's commenting again on the whole argument about detachment, right? And so we just read 75 where he brought in different uh, dialogues that talk about different aspects of detachment. But and now in 76, he's going to continue talking about this. Remembering that this discourse he divides into three parts. The first one is on despising bodily pleasures. That's what we just saw. The next one is going to be about how sense perception doesn't bring true knowledge. And the third one is about how knowing the forms requires a separate soul.
Okay. In the first argument, Socrates seems to disengage the philosopher in the stage of purification from the emotional commitments of public life. In the second, to direct his thoughts upon himself. And the third, upon intelligence, in accordance with the three degrees of purification that we just discussed.
Right. Yeah.
70, so 77, the first pertains to purification of appetites, because that's about how the philosopher doesn't like sensible things. The second of knowledge, so purification of knowledge, I'm not sure. The third of both.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, 76 is pretty straightforward, right? So the emotional commitments of public life. So you could also call that the business about or how political virtue busies itself with affections. So it purifies him from having to measure um, instead of having the right amount of sweets, of just saying, I'm not going to have sweets, or I'm not going to have food for just pleasure, right? Um, and and then the second is to direct his thoughts upon himself. So you don't know through the senses, but only through reasoning, through mathematics and dialectic. And the third then is to know the form. So that's you're directing yourself upon intelligence. And that's already, one step to finishing purification, starting contemplative life. And the point in 77 is that is that there are two kinds of purification. One is of the will, and the other is of the will and our cognitive capacities in general, and the other is of the ways we know. So when you can just reject the physical pleasures, but you're still knowing things, but that you haven't changed how you know. Right. And the second step, you change how you know as well, so you're only knowing through yourself. The third involves both. Um, and this is like typical of Damascus that he wants to emphasize that there's this volitive, this cognitive dimension to nous. So turning towards nous, right, and knowing the forms, that's not just a matter of switching like one way of knowing, which would be like through reasoning, for another, which would be intellectual insight, but rather it's also, not wanting, I don't know, not wanting to know through yourself, but wanting nous, right? So you're changing the your what you desire as well. I think that's the point of 77. There's a
Mhm.
change in our desire when we turn to nous.
I see. Okay.
Mm. This ties up with the
Hmm.
point before that there's something titanic when the soul wants to be independent and know through itself because it's separating itself from what's above it. So if you're turning
Right.
towards what's above you, then you're fixing that, and there's also a volitive dimension there. Now he's going
Hmm.
to in 78 to 92, it's going to be a kind of an excursus on epistemology, but just to remind ourselves, he's commenting this section about that sense perception is an obstacle to true knowledge. So um, it's it's this, which starts with, then what about acquiring true knowledge? Is the body an obstacle when one associates with it in the search for knowledge? I mean, for example, do men find any truth in sight or hearing? Or are not even the poets forever telling us that we do not see or hear anything accurately? And purely if those two physical senses are not clear or precise, other senses can hardly be accurate as they are all inferior to these. Do you not think so? I certainly do. So here there's, he brings in specifically sight and hearing. So we're going to see discussions of these things, and but also the rest of the relations to the other senses. And there's also this kind of like doxographical element of even the poets are telling us that we don't see things accurately. So the text also invites like uh, talking about the opinions concerning who supports sense perception and who doesn't. When he says then, what then he asked, does the soul, when then does he asked, does the soul grasp the truth? Grasped here is haptisthai, so it's literally touch, right? So there, even though here it's like a metaphor, there's this reference to touching, to the sense of touch here. And later, Aristotle compared nous to touching. Um, and also important is that the Plato compares nous to sight, right? Like in the Republic, for instance. For whenever it attempts to examine anything with the body, it is clearly deceived by it. True. Is it not in reasoning, right? So logisdesthai, so that's like having thoughts and arguing. If anywhere that any reality becomes clear to the soul, uh, yes, and indeed the soul reasons best when none of these senses trouble it, neither hearing, nor sight, nor pain, nor pleasure. But when it is most by itself, taking leave of the body, and so far as possible having no contact or association with it in its search for reality, that is so. Um, it is then that the soul of the philosopher most disdains the body, flees from and seeks to be by itself. It appears so. Right, so that's the end of that argument. Um, and again, this reminds us of that thing where he says, that challenge of Aristotle to show that there's a separate activity. They see that that the Phaedo of Plato is already responding to that, by trying to show that the soul does have this separate activity. Um, okay, so
Right.
yeah, well, let's go on. 78.
Okay, so 78. Um, of the body, ignorance is the natural characteristic. For knowledge unites, while the body is utterly divided. Hmm. Intelligence, on the other hand, is absolute knowledge because it is indivisible by its very essence. Intelligence, nous, right?
Right. Yes.
As for the intermediate levels, sense perception is the dimmest kind of knowledge. So intermediate between body, which is totally ignorant, and nous, which would be knowledge itself.
Right.
There's sense perception, which is dimmest because it cannot dispense with the body, which is naturally ignorant. Rational soul, which is something else, is brighter and knows itself, being closer to the indivisible. Imagination is somewhere between them, between the sense perception and the rational soul. It is therefore described as a passive and divisible intelligence.
Right. Um, so a few things here. So the first is I mean, the basic premise here is that the body, the knowledge unites, whereas the body is utterly divided. So this comes up in the elements as well, in the propositions about acting and being acted on, that every body by nature is acted on and everything incorporeal by nature acts. And um, I think that's like 78 or something. Um, yeah. maybe 79, I forget. And the reasoning here is like what's proper to bodies qua bodies is just that they have extended parts. And so you can affect one part without affecting another. Right? So I can put one part of a cloth on fire that doesn't affect the other. And one part of something can uh become cold or wet or dry, and that doesn't necessarily affect the other, that even parts of bodies can come apart, right? They can split into two bodies, and those two bodies continue to exist. And so that's the body is utterly divided, right? So that's what belongs to bodies as such. The contrast is knowledge. And he says that knowledge brings things together, right? Knowledge unites here. Brings things together would be better. It's synagogos to lead things together. Um, and um, the way I understand it is that when you know something, you, in some sense, you have an activity, right? Your knowledge, and that knowledge is the same as the thing, right? So there's something like an activity that is in some respect identical with a substance, something like that. That would be knowledge in some relevant uh, aspect. So if you have um, and knowledge is the changes with its object naturally. So if you, I don't know, if I am looking at the sun and the sun moves, my knowledge, my perception of the sun should change as well. And um, and so knowledge is in some sense dependent on its object and determined by its object. So it is not something which is like a body that can freely detach itself from its object and continue to exist and have its own independent um, processes that have nothing to do with the object. So since bodies, qua bodies, are just, as it were, divisible extension, then by nature they don't know because they're totally independent from each other. Um, then he says intelligence, on the other hand, is absolute knowledge. So you're right, intelligence here is nous, but absolute knowledge is autognosis. So it is knowledge itself, right? So that's like it's the primary knowledge or the form of knowledge. Um, and he says, because it is indivisible by its very essence, right? So the primary case of knowledge, if we're saying like knowledge is an activity that is somehow identical with a substance, is the activity of nous, right? Which is identical with the substance of nous. So nous is the primary case, and body totally lacks this. And then between those, as you mentioned, there's sense perception because it has to happen together with the body. It happens through the body, but it's still some kind of knowledge. Dimmest is a translation, but dim it could also be like the most shadow-filled, scote notate. Um, and the rational soul is more indivisible, right, um than body or sense perception. Um, so then there's the idea that fantasia is called a passive and divisible intelligence. So when Proclus discusses how um, imagination can be called a form of nous in the Timaeus commentary, and there the idea is what distinguishes nous is that instead of grasping the object outside, you have the object in you and you produce the thing. And then indeed, in the case of in that case, it seems clear that imagination is something that you produce, starting from some capacity or object that you already have, and you put it in front of yourself. You make an object of what was a capacity dormant in you. However, it is said here to be passive, and indeed, because the things that you imagine, they are like sense perception, and they depend on they depend on your memory and your memory of perceptions, and also they are divisible. They have extension, they have div independent features, right? So that's why we can imagine things like a horse with wings, because in imagination things are divisible. You can mix and match as you wish, right? They're divisible things. Um, and I mean the passive can also be also the idea that imagination has an affective component can also be involved here. But in any case, he's setting up here a hierarchy of knowledge to make already clear why separation from the body will be uh, key to getting true knowledge. Okay?
Right. And that's basically because of this assumption that knowledge is a uniting thing.
Yeah.
And since
Um,
body is what is essentially divided, then the closer you are to body, the less knowledge you'll have. So the body itself sort of doesn't know anything. I guess that would be the point.
right.
Um, I mean, unless the
Yeah.
body does have some kind of unity, in which case it can know something. But you just say
Yeah.
not as body.
Not as bodies, how he put it. So I mean, I like to think of this example um that my theory of knowledge teacher would like to use, where he'd say, "Look, I can show you that this pen here, it it knows, it has knowledge. So, for instance, if I let go, if I release it, it falls." And you see, it knew exactly when it was supposed to fall, when it was no longer being held up by anything, right? So it knows if it's being held or not. He liked to do this with rolling a chalk across a table. And then he'd say, "Look, the chalk knows how big the table is, because as soon as the table has ended, it fell off. It didn't fall one moment sooner." And so this is, I mean, there are many reasons to do this little game. One is to sh sometimes people do it in order to show, knowledge can't just be reacting to your environment, because these things that we, truthfully don't ascribe knowledge to, they react to their environment, and so that's not enough for you to have knowledge. But it can also be that insofar as these bodies have forms and they're part of the whole world, and they like obey laws of gravity and so on, then they do depend on each other, and so they are not completely separate, and therefore there is some knowledge in them, right? Maybe it's potential knowledge or something like that. But the point is that insofar as they are bodies, they are composed of, sorry, they are composed of form and matter, and the matter means that they can exchange their form for another form. So in some sense, they can lose that. It's proper to the body that they can lose their unity and assume another unity, and therefore what's proper to them is divisibility. Right?
Right. There's knowledge potentially in the sense that if we know the laws or the definition of what the body does or obeys, then we know something. And you would have to say we don't know the body, we know the form of the body. And then turns out bodies are also unknowable. Not only don't they know, they're also unknowable.
Right. Yeah. They have potential knowledge. Yeah, in the sense that in when the forms are enmattered, they become separated from each other. So, for instance, we this specific pen, it has a form, and so it obeys these laws of nature. Um, however, I think the idea is something about how it's a contingent being, and it's doesn't necessarily exist, whereas a scientific understanding, which would be true knowledge, would restore this contingent being. I'm wondering here. Uh, I'm sorry. Um, that was a digression that went nowhere.
Well, I mean, I guess the point would be that you can't know individual bodies, but maybe you would know the form of the body, and which isn't the thing. So nobody knows this pen. You only know pens, which is what scientific knowledge is.
Yeah, maybe, but I'm trying to reach back. At the back of my mind, there's an argument about how um, there must be, well, I guess there must be in some sense embedded in yeah, no, I guess that's right, yeah. So the individual is not knowable. However, for the individual to exist, it has to have some kind of universal form, and therefore it has in it all the it has the as far in an embodied way, in a particularized way, the universal science behind it. Yeah. Hmm. Okay. I apologize. I'm a bit out of it today.
Okay.
Um,
Um, right. Then sense perception, which is basically knowing, like at least accidents of bodies, um, is a kind of knowledge. Just
yeah,
we
it's
had
the
this.
dimmest kind, he says. It's not, it's the worst kind, but it's still some kind of knowledge.
I mean, it's a kind of knowledge because I'm trying to remember. We say it's a kind of knowledge because I mean, because it has like it's the same kind of thing. Like it's somehow the the soul or the knower having information from the outside coming to it or something like that. Um,
Right. Or yeah, we're gonna see in the next few paragraphs that he's gonna defend this Platonic view that actually the perception is just an occasion for knowing. So it's not, for instance, that seeing the blue object makes you know the blue object, but rather it stimulates your soul, which already has the form of the blue, innate concept of of that object to know it, right?
mhm.
So it's not like that. It's depositing it, but it's just provoking your soul to know it. And that's why. But however, the thing is that
But
it's
it's
still
dependent on
very
the body that's outside on this.
exactly, it's dependent on the body to produce it. So whereas the mathematician, for instance, he can analyze a kilodon, right? So something with 1,000 sides, just by deciding, so to speak, to I'm going to work on the kilodon. The You have to go to the pyramids in Giza to look at them. And so you need this passive component, right? So and you it's not entirely in you and up to you. Mm.
Right. And so that's why imagination is in between because imagination is something that is free from the need for something external to stimulate. Or you could always say that it was started from some vision that you did see and it's just memory. Um,
Right.
but on the other hand, is of kind of these kind of things. Um,
Yeah, so it's free, you're putting itself forward, but what you develop in the imagination isn't a thing that's totally united with itself. Right?
and the rational soul meaning as distinct from nous, like the thoughts that take time, things like that.
Exactly. Exactly. What he's going to call it in a different thing. He's going to call it here discursive intelligence or thought. Right. So we'll get there.
Okay. So now Aristotle says, oh, here's the Aristotle says, 79, right? Aristotle says that sense perception is subject to fatigue when turning from larger to smaller objects. I don't remember what this means. That science, on the contrary, derives its knowledge of the smaller from the larger. He ascribes this to
Mm,
the fact that one works through the body, the other without.
right. So he's referring to this um passage from De Anima 3:4, where he's talking about like that if you look at if you have a too intense perception, this will affect your sight of other things. Right. So you can't look at too bright a light. Presumably because that causes the afterglow, right? That it's not called afterglow, it's called something else. But for instance, there's that blue shade that accompanies your sight after you look at the sun for too long or at a lamp. And so they're, looking at having a very intense experience of one thing keeps you from seeing other things, or like your tongue goes numb if you have too much spice. And but Aristotle observes this is not the case for nous, right? Because he says that nous, when it knows something really intelligible, it then understands other things, right? And presumably that can mean like if you know the most intelligible things like principle of non-contradiction, those are the easiest things. And then in light of those general and super understandable principles, other things become understandable, right? So actually very intelligible things help you to understand other things, whereas very perceptible things actually get in the way of you perceiving other things. Um, and here, the opinion is just mentioned. I guess it's just corroboration. Like, see, Aristotle also agrees that the body gets in the way, right? Because Aristotle says this has to do with the fact that sense perception depends on the body, and nous, at least, doesn't have uh, um, uh, a body. Right?
Something like it gets tired. Is that what he said? Yeah, fatigue. Right.
Yeah, it
Like
gets
the body has like
fatigued.
limits, so it gets tired. I feel like it's not a good description, right? It's not like it gets tired. It's more
Well,
like
well, it's not.
it gets overwhelmed by like the sense,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it has to do with the fact that there's this organ of sense that's affected, that's changed in
Okay.
perception, right? Whereas there's no such organ in the case of nous that gets changed. I mean, there there are people, who would disagree with this, and even Aristotelians, right? Because Aristotle also says that there's no nous without imagination. And there are people who think that you can have like a you can vitiate your imagination, right? So if you imagine too much of one thing, then you'll start imagining that everywhere. Like, oh, you read lots of Hegel, and now everything's a triad. Um, and and so that would be like you look at the sun, and now you see the sun everywhere, and then like you're temporarily blinded. Um, Or, you've been studying logic and now you treat everything like an argument. Um, so that would, would be reason to maybe qualify this. The But in any case, that's the idea. But
Right, but but
um,
those qualifications would go back to the sense in which nous does depend on a body. To the extent that it doesn't, it's
precisely,
still
yeah. So it would depend on this Aristotelian thesis that yeah, it depends on like imagination. Yeah.
right. It doesn't get tired in in something be, like there isn't like a body to break or something like that. Uh,
Yeah. Um, because understanding is, I don't know, I want to say something tautological. Understanding is just understanding. Understanding is um, whether things can be understood is just a matter of whether they're placed in the right logical order and with respect to if they're placed in the right relations to the things that explain them. And that's entirely on the side of the thing. It doesn't depend on you or anything like that. And so I think that's the sense in which, nous doesn't depend on a body and it derives its knowledge from of the smaller from the larger. Um, yeah.
something
From
like it makes sense to say I got tired, my eye got tired from looking at something too visible like the sun. It doesn't make sense to say my thinker got tired from thinking thoughts that make too much sense. It does, you obviously do get
exactly.
tired from thinking, but that's not because it's too thinkable. It's because it took too much time and you got tired or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And and if you uh yeah, and also because I think there's also this idea that the most thinkable things are the most universal things. So they won't get in the way of the less universal, of the less thinkable things. Whereas this very visible thing, a very shiny thing, is one thing and it's distinct from the others, right? Of the other visible things. And so it does get in the way of knowing those.
Hmm.
Whereas um, as it were, the intelligibles, they can coexist in the same place at the same time, and therefore they don't get in each other's way. For you to understand something more is like just for you to is not like looking at the sun, it's like making the sun stronger, and then everything becomes more visible. That's also why
Right.
news
There.
that that's also like in 3:5, Aristotle doesn't compare news to the sun, he compares it to light. Right.
Right. It's not looking at the sun, but there is a metaphor, the sun's light, which makes everything visible and so on.
Exactly. Yeah. And looking at the sun can make it more problematic to see other things, but just increasing the light on the dimmer just makes things more visible. Right.
Okay. Some hold, now let's continue. Oh, 80. Some hold that the senses so are reliable and lead to truth. Others despise them as untrustworthy. To the latter group belong Parmenides, Empedocles, and Anaxagoras, who think that the senses are not trustworthy. Parmenides, because he thinks that there aren't things at all, and it seems that there are things, or more than one thing. Empedocles and Anaxagoras, I'm not sure because of there's really these parts and stuff. I don't know. Um,
Right. So Anaxagoras presumably thinks, that there are little bits of bone and things and so on. And those you can't see with the senses. Empedocles believes like in transmigration of souls. And he thinks, for instance, that when you're sacrificing a bull, you might be sacrificing your father.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I think, but I'm not sure entirely about what the background here is.
Okay, to the former Protagoras and Epicurus. Protagoras because there isn't anything besides sense, I guess.
Right, and Protagoras says that, if you're sick and something tastes sweet, then it really is sweet, because
Right.
man is the measure of all things. And Epicurus, yeah, he's a materialist who thinks that senses are how you get knowledge.
Yeah, he's also an atomist, which makes it complicated,
Yes.
though.
Yeah, but I mean, his arguments are all like his arguments start from the senses. Is like, oh, you couldn't if you didn't have atoms, then you couldn't explain things moving around. But, that things move around is
Hmm.
entirely from the senses. So,
Okay. Um, where are we? Plato, however, okay, Plato, however, seems to say both. Both that senses are reliable and lead to truth, and that they don't. I mean, this is a passage where they don't, I guess. Um, the reason is that he believes in a great number of degrees of truth, both in the objects of cognition and as well as in cognition itself, according to the division of the line in the Republic. So this is their Platonic
right.
solution to everything. Like Parmenides is right at one level and Empedocles on another one, and so on.
Right, and Damascus is cottoning on to something that is there in the Republic text, where he uses the adjective that something can be truer than something else. And so he says that like, oh, wouldn't you say that the sight of the sources of the shadows isn't that truer than looking at the shadows? And so this is he's using this relative form of being true. So he accepts that there are many degrees of truth.
Right.
So
Which are correspond to the degrees of reality and therefore to the degrees of knowledge and so on.
yeah.
Um, okay. In what sense, 81? It doesn't say what Aristotle would say.
No, he's
Um,
left Aristotle out. Um, yeah. Again, I think that it's I'm not really sure how he interprets it.
okay. Um, in what sense, let's finish. In what sense does Plato say that sense perceptions fails to attain truth? Insofar as it involves a passive process, which is not knowledge, knowledge being rather an activity.
Right. So the passive process can just mean a passion. So um and the so it can be like an affect, but what's exactly the problem with the passive process? Um, One is that for instance, I see something blue. Now, I have to be seeing the same form of quality, right? The same blue. It has to be the same blue that's on the thing, right? So what makes this knowledge isn't so much that something has changed. For instance, something in me became blue, right? A part of my eye or something like that became blue. But rather that there is this activity of seeing blue, which is identical with the blue of there, right? So there's two distinct things. There's objects affect me through my senses, so I'm somehow changed, and that's a passive process. But what really makes this uh, knowledge is that it's not anything to do with me, right? What makes this knowledge is that that I'm doing something that's the same as that thing out there. Um, Another way of putting this is like when if we think of knowledge as stamping, like stamping wax, right? So if a wax board and stamp it. The if you just stamp the wax, what you get is an image of what was stamped, right? And so it's kind of determined by the wax, and it's kind of determined by what's stamping, by the seal that you're using. But this um, impression on the wax is a knowledge, gives you knowledge of the seal only insofar as it's identical with that thing. And nothing, and the fact that it's an impression, the fact that it's a result of a passive process, does not contribute to that. So that's the point that knowledge is an activity, and it's also an activity in the case of perception. But in the case of perception, this is a always accompanied by a passive process.
And therefore it's not true, meaning, well, he switched from it being not true and to it being not knowledge.
Um,
Like one would think that truth is precisely a passive thing. Like if truth means correspondence to what is outside.
um, if truth is correspondence outside, you'd think it was a passive thing, but it would not not necessarily, because the point about the passive is that it involves change, and change implies being in a different situation, whereas the the only part of truth that's relevant here um, uh, is identity. Also, the thing is the knowledge, right? He's talking about attaining truth. So attaining truth is um, you can understand that as knowledge, right? So why to that's one way of glossing it. I don't think he really changed the subject here.
Mm.
Um, right. The Yeah, there's also like this general idea that if I need a passive process, then I need the object to act on me. And so I see things from the perspective of how the object acts on me. Whereas the contrast is like I know what a triangle is. And so I don't know, I can prove that a triangle has 180 degrees. Uh, that the sum of its angles is 180 degrees. Um, so uh, I can do that and that's not because the triangle is impacting me in any way. Therefore, it's has nothing to do with my perspective or relation relative to the triangle. So it's the whole triangle that's no. I mean, that's also a consideration. It's not the first consideration I brought here because it's not because here he's emphasizing this connection between activity and knowing, right? Another way that, I mean, there's a way of speaking that knowledge has to be an activity, but that's more like modern, but it's worth bringing up. Knowledge has to be an activity because it's something that we give reasons for, right? If you know something, you give reasons for it. And and so it's something that you do, and so it's something you're responsible for. Whereas a purely passive process can only give you an excuse, right? So like um I don't know, I'm sorry, I just can't help seeing this blue thing in front of me. But if like this is like a criticism that you sometimes have these causal theories of perception, like that the blue in I keep talking about blue because I'm looking at this blue light that's shining on my webcam, and the blue light like enters affects my eye, and then my eye affects my brain, and I have to see blue from that. But like, well, how is that different from being brainwashed into seeing blue? Right? That's a purely passive process, right?
Hmm.
Uh, the um, it's also the that question that's like also what raises these hypotheses nowadays of like, what if you're a brain in a vat? What would it change? How do you know you're not a brain in a vat? Or McDowell has this thing, yes, we are brains in vats, vats made of tissues and nerves and meat and things like that. We are brains in vats. Um, but anyway, so that's like a different reason for thinking that knowledge has to be an activity. But that's like activity in a stronger sense, right? It's not just energeia. It's like activity and it's in like self-directed reflexive thing. Um,
It
I
would be
think
something like you. Okay, so because I'm thinking about this, like it seems to be good that knowledge doesn't depend on you because otherwise it's like there's imagination is knowledge that entirely depends on you, and that's why it doesn't give truth. Um, but it's also something not knowledge and saying that it entirely doesn't depend on you because we like maybe there isn't choice or something in knowledge, right? Because I can't choose the reason to be different, or I can't choose to know other than how I know or something like that. But I do want it to be me that is knowing or whoever the knower is. Otherwise, it's like being forced by the circumstances. So, like on the one hand, you have sense perception, which has all the like objectivity that we want from knowledge, but without the responsibility. And on the other hand, we have imagination, which has all the responsibility, but none of the objectivity. And then knowledge is something that combines the objectivity of sense perception with the responsibility of imagination. Does that make sense?
yeah, it makes sense. I mean, also like although imagination is not just whimsical fantasy, it can also be like you hear that, oh, someone tripped and hurt themselves, and then you imagine them falling down. And that, that is responsive to things outside. It's not just entirely as for free. So in that sense, imagination can be responsible and it can be objective knowledge. The What I was going to say about that is, yeah, so the knowledge wants to be the expression of something, I guess. And it wants to be, yeah, precisely. It wants to be the expression of the thing and not how the thing is reflected in other things, right? It wants to be just the expression of the thing itself, right? And that's why it should be an activity, right? It shouldn't be a case of one thing acting on another. It should just be an activity of the thing. And therefore, because if it's a case of one thing acting on another, then it's just going to be show one aspect or one relation of that thing. Whereas if it's an activity, it's going to be it can be independent of anything else, right? So that's the idea of what we want knowledge to be, and why
Hmm.
if it's dependent on so in order for you to see Niagara Falls, you have to go to Niagara Falls, and because there's nothing like being there. If you look at a photo, it's not enough, and you have to be there, and or Iguazu Falls or whatever, some very impressive thing.
Right. And
Um,
because the photo might give you imagination and maybe an accurate imagination, but not perception.
yeah, not perception. And in that sense, however, that also means that there's the knowledge of Niagara Falls will always be in some sense limited because we can't have, as it were, a knowledge of Niagara Falls in itself, right? Because when you remove Niagara Falls from all of its relations, it's nothing, because that's like what bodies are, right? Bodies. Um, Bodies, because they are by nature always divided or divisible. If you take them away from the things that unite them, then they fall apart. There's no there there. Um, so so that seems to be the problem of sense perception. Right, since there's this correspondence between sense perception and perceptibles, we can also think about it in terms of perceptibles, right? So the same way like sense perception doesn't really attain truth because it involves a passive process, we can also say that perceptibles don't attain true reality because they involve um, a reciprocal action on each other, right? And they don't have an independent existence. I guess that's one way of also understanding this.
Right. Versus knowledge that would need to be somehow the knower itself, like there's activity on both sides, is what happens. Like activity of the knowing is um is somehow the same as the activity of the knowledge of the intelligible thing being known. But it's like what it is in
Right.
itself as something that can be known.
Yeah, because ideally it's just you knowing ideally it's the same thing, right? They fall into to one. You just know yourself, which is the intelligible object in you makes itself known, like a light going off in your head. Um, the so again the passive process, intelligible. Oh, I was gonna say something, but I forgot it.
Okay,
Um, shall I move on?
yeah, let's continue then. Just continue. 82. If sense perception is not exact, how can it become a principle of demonstration? So this is the other sense. It does become a principle of demonstration, and that's at least one sense in which sense perception is taken to be accurate. And the answer would be sense perception stirs the memory. But the soul produces the principles from itself. Nothing indeed can derive its perfection any more than its existence from what is inferior to it. Take, for example, the lower form of science, which cannot provide the principles for the higher one.
Right. So here I guess that sense perception provides principles of demonstration in the sense that, you can start with universal propositions that are about perceptibles, right? And then he um, replies, well, the perception just stirs the memory here is anamnesque. So it just stirs anamnesis, um, recollection, right? It causes you to recollect and the forms that you or the principles that you already have in your soul, right? So I was just saying before. So for instance, we don't learn the shapes from perception because actually perception always gives us imperfect shapes that have some width, that have, that are three-dimensional and things like that. Whereas, mathematics deals with these pure shapes, and we can't derive a pure something better from something lower. Rather, the lower thing, we recognize the inferior shapes, the inexact shapes, because we already know what the exact shapes are like.
Right.
Mm,
Um, okay. So that's, I mean, then sense perception is not true, but it has this other like function. Doesn't really explain
right,
how, of like assisting or causing somehow the memory of these
right. I
things
mean,
in the soul.
I, presumably it's that I mean, something like that perception changes the body, and the body then is in a suitable situation to express those principles in the soul, right? So it's the same way that why doesn't your foot see? It's because there isn't an organ of sight in your foot. So why am I not now seeing the Amazon rainforest? Because there is no organ for seeing the Amazon rainforest right now in me. Uh, I will only have that uh, thing that can receive knowledge of forests, visual knowledge of forests, when my eye is looking at the Amazon rainforest.
Okay, and the same way you somehow have the memory of the shape when you see a somewhat imperfect representation of it and so on.
Right. And also and then like it's the same principle then that also explains like um why
Mm,
like why can you he's going to talk about this later actually like why can you suffer mentally from bodily illness like if your brain is damaged. And then again, well, it's not that the soul depends on the brain, it's just that you need the right receptacle for the brain for the soul to be present in it, right? And so
hmm.
also for perception, you need the right receptacles for these principles to be activated.
Okay. 83. No, no. Some of the senses are predominantly passive. 83. Some of the senses have been given to us with a view to existence, other to higher perfection. Don't know what this means. And then someone else says it is better to make it clear that the difference is one of degree only.
Right. Um, a different way of translating that would be that of the senses, some are for being and the others for being well, right? So some we need to exist, some are given for us to educate ourselves, for instance.
Mm.
And that seems to be the Proclean view. And then Damascus says, well, actually, they're all for both, but it's a matter of degree only. Like these are more for us to be able to learn, and these are more for us to exist, but not for us to, for everything, we need all the senses. Um, and um, here it's stated that, yeah, we'll get back to this, but there's a, 'cause he also comes back to this later in the text about which ones the gods have and so on. And so like Proclus attributed hearing and sight to the celestial gods, but then Damascus disagrees with these. But I mean, this is a different issue.
So the point would be something like that sense, touch or taste or something is more for existing, and seeing would be something to.
Yeah, I think that that's right. That like, and it's also like comparison with animals. Like animals, some animals can barely see, but they can, they can taste and smell very well because they have to feed themselves. But being able to see and hear, then and to see and hear well the way we can. Well, that's you need that just to be able to like do science and contemplate the world.
Mhm. Okay. 84 it says the same thing in the question of passive and active. Some of the senses are predominantly passive, others active, meaning sight and hearing. which are more active, or
Yeah, that they're more active. I guess the others they need a greater change, as it were, in the body. Right? So like you can smell you they're little literally like particles of the thing that are entering out and things.
Mhm.
Whereas sight and hearing, it's not the case that they that it's a direct contact with another body.
Right, that
For
would
instance, though
right,
we
that
would
would be
disagree.
Aristotle's.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Aristotle would look for like ways in which there is a touch and sense and things like that, and seeing.
That's true. That's true. But like since for instance like we can all see the same thing at the same time, but we can't all touch the same surface at the same time. There's like this distinction. We can all hear the same speech being given. Hmm.
Mhm. Okay. 85. The corresponding elements will show the difference in character between the senses, which are assigned to several elements in the Timaeus. Um,
Like
does he
and
tell us? No.
like the sight sight is fire and touch is earth, but hearing air, taste water, smell both air and water. Yeah. So
Hmm.
here so since the highest spot is uh, the highest are sight and hearing, which belong to fire and air, and the lowest are taste and touch, which belong to water and earth and smell.
Hmm. 86. Some senses exist already in heaven. Again, probably the sight and hearing. Others are
Yeah,
required by the souls as it descends.
right. So yeah, so like up there, we only see beings that are entirely luminous and therefore you probably only need sight there, perhaps hearing, insofar as they also talk about things like the harmony of the muses, of the spheres, and you need to be moving in tune, like at the right rhythm with all the other planets. So there's the movement of the planets often compared to a dance. So maybe you'll need some kind of hearing, some kind of sensitivity to proportion, things like that. And then the others, you need them as the soul descends. Yeah. But also, it's like not just this. Yeah, this is complicated because it's not just the senses. Elsewhere, they talk about, for instance, that only you only need the imagination when you arrive in the person in the changing.
Hmm.
So there are many soul capacities that are acquired as the soul descends.
Okay. Um, and these senses would be something in like in these like other bodies somehow.
Yeah, yeah. So our bodies, our physical bodies, the bodies that are doctors treat, they are the seat of the five senses, as we know them. But the imagination is in our pneumatic body, and in our luminous body, our astral body, which is just light, we have something like sight. However, it's different because it what it sees is place, right? So place for Proclus is light, and because it's three-dimensional, but it has to be a body since it has separate parts. But it's a body that occupies the same body as other bodies, right? For him, only light can do that. And so this sight of the astral body is like when you look at something and you know its shape, right? So, and that shape isn't inferred from like shadows and hues and things like that, but it's some kind of direct um, X-ray vision, as it were, because you grasp the whole body. Right? That's the kind of sight that it's only analogously sight. Yeah. something like
I
a
get it.
sense of spatial
Um,
presence.
mhm.
Okay.
But we call that sight, like that sight of colors and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's. I mean, it's only an analogous. Yeah. We call it sight here, but I think it's really just analogous. The more I think about it, it's
Hmm.
okay.
Okay, 87. Thought is discursive intelligence, and insofar inferior to nous, right? To intelligence. But qua intelligence, it is superior to sense perception and imagination. It is an activity of the rational soul. Therefore, when it lifts itself up to intelligence, it is illuminated by the light of the intellective truth. But when it stoops down to irrational knowledge, it is dimmed by the darkness of falsehood, of the falsehood that is inherent in the senses.
Right. So this goes back to questions about the three stages of purification, turning towards nous, turning away from irrational knowledge. So he uses thought here, that's logismos. That's that can also mean like reasoning. It's the noun corresponding to logisdesthai, which is the verb that was used in the Phaedo passage. That here in the Cooper is, yeah, it's translated as reasoning. Um, and right, so what does it mean here to lift itself up to intelligence and stoop down to irrational knowledge? Probably has to do with something like if it uses as its premises things it knows through nous, or if it uses as its premises things it knows through perception, right? And that's by turning towards yourself and then using what you know, like your innate concepts, is one step of purification. And then a further step of purification is turning towards not just your innate concepts, like in mathematics, but rather um, the intuitive realizations that you have or insights that you have during dialectics, and that's turning towards
Hmm.
nous. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, that's the how do you call it? That's the like the act of reasoning isn't itself intelligence, but it's somehow illuminated by that light if it.
Yeah, it can be illuminated by the light, as I said in the beginning, by its like starting point. Um, Proclus also in his on Euclid, he talks about how the soul, like when it finishes, as it were, developing something in mathematics, then it has, as it were, it's like worked out everything there is to know about let's say some kind of mathematical object, some kind of solid. Then it will um, then it can have, as it were, an insight that synthesizes all of that. And so that's like a better kind of insight, which isn't just that it took its axioms from something self-evident, but rather it managed to see all this knowledge summarized in a single activity. Right? That's also being illuminated by the light of intellective truth. Right?
Hmm.
So that's more like what Plato talks about in the seventh letter, where after discussing some matter a lot and thinking about it, then all of a sudden a spark goes off and you understand it. Oh, that's what it means. And And these are two very distinct experiences. One is just, wow, I can just stipulate things and work things from them, and my knowledge is clear. And the other thing is like, I have some kind of concrete grasp of an object through and through. I know what it is.
Hmm. Right. So in the first one, we wouldn't really, you wouldn't maybe really know it or something. Just use it, something like that.
Right, yeah. Or it's certainly It's you would know it better than you would know it if you just observed it through the senses, but it's not true knowledge from nous. Yeah.
Okay. 88. Intellection is sometimes described as sight because it is an impassive activity. So we have these like different metaphors for intellection, which we discussed before. Sometimes we call it sight, and it's because it's impassive, because it sees, it's how do we say? Um, it's active, like we say sight is active. Um, Sometimes or isn't changed as much. That's like the thing. Like sight is something somehow seeing the thing makes more sense to speak of seeing what the thing is than it would make sense to like smelling what it is or something like that. Um,
Right.
Sometimes as touch because it is united with its objects so as to become all but identical with them, right? So it's touch in the sense of it's there. It's really even more than touch, I guess. Um, in all forms of knowledge, the object must be present. But in sense perception, there are only images of things perceived, the things themselves being at the distance. In intelligence, the primary intelligibles themselves are present. In soul, which is in between these, there are only images, it is true, but images so closely linked with the originals that the surfaces could be said to touch.
Right. So, um, yeah, the why are these images so the the images in sense perception are separate from their objects, as I was talking about how bodies are separate from each other, right? And however, the images in the soul, they are directly caused by their originals, right? So they're inseparable from their originals in a certain sense. So I gave this example of the complete, you discuss something thoroughly or you analyze something completely in a mathematical investigation, and then you understand what it is. And so you've just, as it were, produced or unfolded an image in your soul, but this image in your soul is now, as it were, complete and it's apt to receive the light and participate in that intelligible object that's always around, right? That nous that's always around. In that sense, um, they're so closely linked that the surfaces could be said to touch. Right? Um, the so what's a different way of saying that? You can the the logoi in the soul, the concepts in the soul are never going to be intelligible objects. They're never going to be noes because they're sometimes potential and they're sometimes active. But when they are active, they can have the same activity as the intelligible objects, right? Whereas the activity of the perception is never going to is can be an activity of the same quality of what it perceives, but it's never going to be the self same activity because they're two distinct objects, two distinct bodies. Um,
So, right. So, like, if we use this like thing that we always say that soul is in time, what like nous is all the time, sometimes what it is all the time. Um, we could say so the kind of grasping to use the touch metaphor that the soul has is um like going to grasp one moment of the entire eternal or always present in time truth that is the nous, something like that.
Right. Or yeah, if you want, it's like the nous ha exhibits all its parts all the time together in the present. Whereas the soul has to go through all the parts one by one. But when it's gone through all the parts, it can have this activity where it knows all those parts together, right? And then it has the same activity as the nous. But this activity is different because it came to be in time, and it's probably going to disappear in time because the soul's going to go do other things. But the soul can have that same thing. Another way of thinking about the contrast here, also with perception, is like I can see the sun. And then my perception of the sun, however, is going to be different from what the sun does because the sun is shining, whereas I'm not shining when I see the shining sun. However, when I understand something, when I understand an intelligible, like I don't know, the triangle or time, or yeah, like the sort of cyclical process, the life cycle of the bee. I what I am understanding, like my activity, is to produce knowledge, and that's exactly what the form of the life cycle, form of the bee does. It produces that knowledge. So in this case, I'm as it were shining as well, right? And also putting forth knowledge. Um, and that's also like, although there's this metaphor of nous illuminating us, it's not that, it acts on us from outside, like looking at the sun, but rather a light goes off. It provokes us to understand something too. It provokes an activity in us. Okay.
Right, right. For all of this, we need the um intelligible to be something that makes itself intelligible or makes itself known.
Yeah, yeah. Every intelligible is a nous, every nous is an intelligible. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. So those would be the three levels here of knowledge. We said body is no knowledge. There's sense perception, which is some kind of knowledge. Um, and oh, right, but we have only images because it's not the thing itself. And intelligence, we have the thing itself, and so we have something of the thing itself. We could say it's touching the thing itself, but it's not identical to it. So he says it.
Right.
Um, the surfaces can touch, which would be another way of saying a touch only on one side, like only on one dimension of it. That's how it would like surface. It's not of the
Yeah.
whole.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess. I'm not sure what the emphasis on the surfaces here is supposed to mean. Maybe it's this idea that if we're thinking about it, it's the activities are identical, and the activities is thought of as it were as the surface
Hmm.
of the substance. The question then is, of course, that the nous is something that exposes itself totally. Everything is on the surface, right? Um, whereas what has something hidden and something that hasn't come to the surface yet, but could be to the surface, that's only the soul.
Mm.
But
Right.
sometimes the soul can have a surface that touches um, uh, that that touches the surface of nous. That's actually a bit like that reminds me of talking about surfaces. We mentioned this before when I was talking about uh, the Alcibiades, and this argument to do with the reflection. Uh, like you look in someone's eye and you see yourself reflected. And nous is something like that for us. And there, it's a property of the surface. It's so shiny. That's what makes it reflect. And Proclus interprets the smoothness of the surface of the world like this. It's so smooth, it's so shiny, and that it somehow then can receive the images of the forms. Or if that, like it, or the body of the world can receive the intellections of its soul. I forget. Well, there it's a case of it's not touching, it's reflection, so it's sight. But that's it's just something interesting to think of another case of where the surfaces are used in these epistemological contexts.
Right. But this is
What
what we
are
always like think of like you can only see one side of a solid shape at a time, but you can think all of it at once or something like that.
right? And that's an interesting remark because it also shows like how this astral sight is close to thought, right? Because you would grasp all the sides at once.
Okay.
Um, okay, we're getting close to our time.
Yeah, I think we're
So
done,
yeah,
basically.
next week, the 25th.
To finish should be fine, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
as far as I
yeah,
know.
do the do the
Yeah, we'll have to take care of that.
transfer. Okay,
Okay.
great. Thank you.
And I, yes. And I.